Commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the first Arab conference on human rights is held in Doha to discuss protecting human rights in the Arab world. Are human rights up to international standards in the region? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Imran Garda. Justice and human rights ministers of Arab countries and representatives of local and international organizations that deal with human rights are holding their first meeting in Doha. Besides massive and systematic human rights abuses in occupied lands like Palestine, where daily abuses take place either by Jewish settlers or the Israeli army, and in Iraq, where the name Abu Ghraib has become symbolic of atrocities committed under occupation, Asian labourers in the Gulf countries also suffer from a variety of human rights abuses. Yet the main issue under discussion remains the abuse of the Arab citizen by his government under a security pretext. So what do the participants in this conference hope to achieve from their gathering in Doha? This is what some of them had to say.
We are expecting positive results which could benefit the individuals in the Arab world, whether in occupied Palestine, the Gaza Strip or elsewhere. And we hope that the Arab efforts progress in the field of human rights to reach the international level of attention given to human rights issues.
I hope that we will reach a strategic plan for a Arabic human rights issue. Now we are all working with the help or assistance of national or international society, and we hope that the Arabic will all go together to give a special plan, a strategic plan to work on a human rights issue in the Arab country.
No doubt, human rights and civil rights issues in the Arab world are lagging behind compared to international standards. This is mainly due to the lack of interest or coordination of Arab governments and the confusion in understanding what human rights mean, as well as the wrong perception that human rights contradict with the Islamic faith. This has to change.
Well, joining us now are our guests in Doha, Fateh Azam. He's the Middle East representative of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Also in Doha, Hassan Ibrahim. He's a journalist and writer on human rights issues. And in Washington, D.C., Joe Stork. He's the Deputy Director for the Middle East and North Africa at Human Rights Watch. Thanks for joining us, gentlemen. Hassan Ibrahim, if I could start off with you, the entire issue of human rights in the Arab world and perhaps the lack thereof. How bad is the situation as things stand?
I think the situation is pretty bad. And the reason why is that Arab regimes continue to violate human rights with impunity. We have also, we live in a very dangerous neighborhood in this planet. You have the Arab countries, and then you have Israel, you have Iran, you have Turkey. And human rights violations are rampant. The Human Rights Charter on human rights is being ignored for two reasons. One, the strategic importance of a country like Israel, or the hydrocarbon wealth of the Arab world and the strategic location. And unfortunately, for political expediency, a lot of the custodians of the human rights in the world ignore the violations that happen here. What happened, for example, in Abu Ghraib in Iraq was just a clear example of what goes on in each and every detention center in the Arab world. And I was very amazed that people were mystified. How come this happens in Iraq? It happens. It happens everywhere. Yes, it was uglier because it was done by an occupier, but it happens. The situation, you even find people justifying torture for the sake of national security. You have women being denied basic rights. You have minorities being denied even passports. You have people denied the freedom to worship. I mean, it is pretty bad.
Fateh Azam, Hassan Ibrahim paints a very bleak picture. What do you make of that?
Well, it is a rather difficult situation for sure. I think, however, we need to remember to be somewhat optimistic. There are movements, and I think we need to encourage these movements. Recently, the new Arab Charter for Human Rights has come into force this year. And right now we're in Doha in a discussion about putting together a kind of a strategic plan for implementing aspects of the program, for implementing the charter and encouraging governments and working with governments and civil societies in order to create some change to alter this difficult situation.
Joe Stork, would you agree with Mr. Azam that there are great reasons to be optimistic?
I don't know about great reasons to be optimistic, but I think the fact that this meeting is happening, you know, years ago, you wouldn't find this kind of meeting happening. In fact, you'd find Arab governments and the Arab League denying any applicability of human rights at all to the Arab world. I hope this meeting is a constructive one, and I think it's worth pointing out that, you know, what's missing in too many Arab countries, in most Arab countries, is the right of free association, the right of people to form organizations, independent organizations, to monitor, to report on, to expose human rights violations. And I think that I would suggest that should be a key priority at this meeting in terms of implementing the charter. And I think steps need to be taken to bring the charter completely into line with international standards. But I think taking a strategic view and looking first and foremost at the right to free association and the right to free expression, then we could perhaps be much more optimistic about human rights in the Arab world.
Mr. Stork, your organization and many other organizations put pressure on governments. Your own government puts pressure on particular governments in the region. What about those who say there's a lot of Western hypocrisy because there's pressure put on countries that are not allies, that are enemies, whereas there's a disregard and an ignoring of human rights abuses of allies of Western superpowers?
No, you're absolutely right. Human rights is highly politicized by governments, not just the United States, but certainly the United States, with its double standards, as you just noted, is a prime contributor here. But look, governments do politicize human rights, which is why I go back to my point that it's important to get independent actors to let citizens have their voice on human rights, because governments, frankly, are always going to be taking a very instrumentalist view. But I agree that the sort of double standards approach of just criticizing our allies and not our and just criticizing our adversaries and not our allies really undermines, it really corrodes the whole concept of human rights. But again, it's important to note that I think this is what happens all too often by the Arab states also, in the Human Rights Council, for instance, where, you know, the only the focus on Israel, while appropriate, is completely one-sided. This is something that's got to change.
Hassan, do you want to come in there?
Well, what I would like to say is that we need structural changes in the Arab world in order for any conference or any changes to be applicable. The emphasis on Israel is, I agree, it's one-sided because there are violations on the other side, and I condemn both sides equally. But the problem with Israel is that it's even more entrenched because it's a dehumanization of a whole ethnic group, of a whole people. And the Palestinian people have been denied every single right since 1948. And now the recent remarks by the Sibel Livni, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, saying that the creation of a Palestinian state will solve the problem of Arabs inside Israel is a very racist statement, and unfortunately it went unchecked in the international press. Funny enough, the only people that criticized the statement by Livni were Israeli journalists. So the criticism is across the board. The problem with the Arab world is that in order for all these conferences and all these forums to succeed, we need structural changes. We have structural problems that would inhibit any sort of, of change, not just erecting bodies and all that.
Okay, Hassan, sorry to interrupt you. Fateh Azam, what about the UN's approach to different scenarios? Because would you agree to some extent with those who claim that it's in many ways pointless trying to expect high regard for human rights in conflict zones, that conflict zones are a different kettle of fish compared to zones that are at peace? For example, in Sudan, both the government and the rebels in Darfur have been accused of extraordinary abuses of human rights.
Yes, I would say they're not exactly a different kettle of fish, but different requirements are needed for these various situations. In a situation of peace where there is no armed conflict, human rights law applies in all its requirements, particularly if a state is party to international human rights treaties that provide for certain legal obligations that states have to apply. In a time of armed conflict, these obligations continue to apply generally, but then international humanitarian law applies, where a different level of regard and a different set of crimes are defined that need to be dealt with and that need to be held to account for. Indeed, when in times of armed conflict, the requirements are much higher, but much more difficult to arrive at. And that requires concerted international action to make it happen.
Hassan Ibrahim, the abuse of the human rights of migrant laborers, especially in the Gulf, workers from India, Nepal, Vietnam, etc., and other countries not getting paid their salaries on time, some not getting paid their salaries at all, living in squalid conditions, etc. Would this issue even be under discussion at this conference of Arab leaders?
I haven't attended the conference yet, but they should be discussed, because it is a shame that these people, the multitudes of workers that are building the Arabian Gulf, are treated this way. I know in some Gulf countries there have been legislations to improve the conditions of these workers, but they are not enough. And as I said, unless there is a concerted effort from both civil society groups and the governments and public awareness in general, these problems will never be solved.
All right, gentlemen, it's time for a quick break. We'll have more on the other side of this. Do stay with us.